Guadalcanal, 75 years ago, they landed on Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, 1942. Battle lasted for 6 months until 9 February 1943. The costs were terrific. More than 7,000 Americans lost their lives in the battles, including 1,600 ashore, plus several hundred have died of disease like malaria, and 5,000 at sea. Naval battle was intense. We lost 24 ships, over 600 aircraft. The Japanese were determined to kick us off. They committed 50,000 to the operation. They lost 25,000 lives, 1,500 ashore plus diseases, and 4,000 at sea. 24 ships were sunk, and they had more than 1,000 aircraft. I didn't have time to find out how many aircraft they lost, but it was amazing because we had so many aces in the Cactus Air Force. It was America's first ground offensive of World War II. And it was the first action, a ground offensive action after Pearl Harbor. The historians say that it was the most important battle of the Pacific in World War II. Japanese and American historians say that. In fact, a Japanese general of the 35th Brigade, General Kawaguchi, said, "Guadalcanal is no longer merely a name of an island in Japanese military history. It's the name of the graveyard of the Japanese Army." Admiral Halsey said this about the battle: "Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours." This is one reason we look at it, and there's several reasons, but we always look at the Battle of Guadalcanal here at the Marines Memorial. And I'll tell you why before I finish. 8 months before the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, see this red line here? The Japanese controlled everything, Borneo, Philippines, everything in this area when the Marines went into Guadalcanal. World War II started with Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands, and then we had Wake Island, then we had the Battle of Singapore, where Singapore surrendered 130,000 British troops, 80,000 POWs. And Winston Churchill said it was the greatest disaster in the British Empire. There was this myth about the Japanese being superior soldiers. And the Philippines, they surrendered Bataan on 6 May. 3 days prior to that operation, there was a battle down at Coral Sea. And Coral Sea was a naval battle that we didn't win tactically, but we had a strategic victory because we stopped the Japanese from sending a force on New Guinea. And then in June of 1942, they had the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway was a strategic and a tactical victory. We knocked out 4 carriers for the Japanese, and we lost only 1. It gave the Americans hope. It was a real shot in the arm, the Battle of Midway. And it gave the Americans hope, and they thought, maybe we can start an offensive with the troops that we have in the Pacific. You know, America had chosen, along with the British, to say that Europe was priority in both men and supplies. But with the Battle of Midway, we think we can do it with what we have in the Pacific, they said. Back in March early 42, back in the USA, at a place called New River, North Carolina, they started a Marine base there. Major General Vandergrift was there. He was commanding the 1st Marine Division. It was a brand new place, and it just started construction. It was a swamp, essentially. Swamp Lejeune, as they call it, Camp Lejeune. he was starting to train the 1st Marine Division. He's a young officer. That's when he was promoted to 1st Lieutenant in 1914. He had a career that wasn't unusual. He did not go to World War I. And he always felt that his career was hurt because he didn't participate in World War I. But he spent a lot of time in Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and China, where I think it was pretty good jungle training in preparation for World War II. When he took command of the 1st Marine Division, General Vandegrift was 55 years old, 33 years of military service, including multiple tours in Panama, Haiti, Nicaragua, China, as I said. Who would have thought those 3 years of jungle training be so valuable? And he had a key instinct for talent. Previously, and while serving in Haiti, he transferred a Sergeant Louis Puller to his command. He was so impressed with Puller that he recommended him for a commission. The first offensive by Allied ground forces against the Japanese. This was a test. The ground combat strength of the United States against the ground combat strength of the Japanese. The objective on Guadalcanal was to seize that airfield. This was done quickly, but Tulagi was different. Tulagi was defended, and it took the Raider battalions 24 hours to defeat 900 Japanese. But Guadalcanal, there was no opposition. So 75 years ago, on 7 August 42, Marines landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Neither island was any treasure. There were all the negatives of a tropical island and none of the positives. Before the 6-month battle ended, there would be a Marine, Navy, and Army Air Corps operating from the Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal, and plus Marines and Army soldiers fighting together. As I mentioned earlier, after the war ended, both sides, American and Japanese, agreed Guadalcanal was a turning point in the war. This is where we discovered we could meet these tough Japanese soldiers in the most adverse conditions and beat them. This is a map of Guadalcanal showing where we landed with the objective here at the airfield. Initially, with no resistance, General Vandegrift was anxious to achieve the objective, the airfield. You know, I'd like to highlight some aspects of General Vandegrift's leadership. In his memoirs, he writes, "Defeatism is a terrible disease in a military organization. It can spread faster than dysentery or malaria. Because of that, I've always tried to display confidence during my daily tours of the perimeter." Another reflects his views on combat stress, post-traumatic stress. In his memoirs, he describes the impact of his Marines of the Japanese naval gunfire. To my knowledge, his division is the only U.S. military force of any service ever to be subjected to enemy naval gunfire. The Japanese fired 12 and 14-inch shells at the Guadalcanal Marines. Experts would tell you that naval gunfire is the most impactful on the psyche of anybody on their brain. Here's what General Vandegrift wrote. "Like everyone else on the perimeter, I set out to bombardment hoping against a direct hit on my dugout. Man comes close to himself at such times. People have since asked me my attitude toward shell shock or combat fatigue. Being a good Presbyterian, I could only reply, there for the grace of God, go I." He goes on to say, "This probably requires amplification. Unless the reader has experienced naval or artillery fires, or aerial bombing, he cannot easily grasp a sensation compounded of frustration, helplessness, fear, and in case of close hits, shock. One night, early in the Guadalcanal campaign, a doctor and a chaplain, both fairly senior, were in my CP discussing combat fatigue. The doctor could not understand it. "Look at us," he said. "We're all much older and we aren't touched by it." The chaplain averred that faith was the true defense. As is my wont when dealing with experts, I kept quiet. That night, a shell from an enemy destroyer burst close to the doctor's dugout. He was not wounded physically, but his mental hurt caused the division surgeon to evacuate him. A week later, a shell struck close to the chaplain's dugout. Again, he was not wounded, but he had to be evacuated the next day. There, for the grace of God, go I.